My name's Adrian White, and I'm here to talk about my experience of psychosis, which happened over 20 years ago now. I currently work in mental health. However, I did struggle for some time to get to be a professional in my job because of the psychosis, which in total lasted around about 2 years. And my experience started where I was dabbling with street drugs and thought I knew what I was doing with them, and so I was taking certain drugs. Then the drugs I was taking were ecstasy and amphetamines. People who take drugs think that they're in control, they know what they're doing, they know what they're taking, but the human mind is far more delicate than the drugs that they're taking, and you can never tell how it's going to go. So if I have any advice, it would be don't do it. If you haven't done it, don't do it, and if you're doing it now, maybe think about stopping, because it could happen. And I'm not an unusual case, it happens to quite a lot of people who take drugs. And I was taking them for probably around about 6 months before my psychosis happened. And my psychosis happened as a change in reality, which is what happens to most people who get psychosis. Their reality changes. And my reality changed to a point where I became very scared that people were after me and became very paranoid. Thought people were following me and they were plotting against me. And that was very uncomfortable. And I did lots of things to try and stop that from happening. In the end, I felt like I couldn't control any of it. So the only thing that I could do was to take my life, which I tried in many ways to try and end my life, which included taking overdoses. It included cutting my wrist. It included trying to electrocute myself in the bath. And because nothing seemed to work, I got to a point where I just gave up and I thought, I can't do this. I thought killing yourself would be easy, but for me it was very difficult. Thankfully, it was very difficult. And my reasoning after that was, I'll just lay here, not eat, not drink, and I'll just wait to die. And it was only the result of friends really noticing I wasn't at work, getting in contact with somebody who knew my landlord, that eventually they came and let themselves in and found me. Or I think I would have just died. Family and social support, friends, were critical for my recovery. And I think it's so important that if anybody's watching this who has been through psychosis or is going through psychosis, not to push family and friends away is probably advisable. We really need the support. I don't think I would have recovered like I did without the support from family and friends. I mean, I think my friends and family were, I don't know if they really understood what was happening or what I was going through, but they never really talked about it in that way, and I found it quite difficult to talk about. So I didn't talk about it a lot to start with. It took me quite some time to talk about it. So there might have been understanding at the time, but they didn't show a lack of understanding, and they were very caring towards me and what my needs were. But I do think that there has been a stigma within that. I'm sure there were people who I knew that were thinking, oh, Adrian's mad, he's taking drugs and he's mad, and because I'm sure I would have used those sort of words at the time. Now I understand it differently. I think when people use the word mad, it's different from what mental health professionals use. Well, they don't use terms like that, but I certainly, my reality had changed, and I certainly wasn't thinking very straight. So maybe madness is an interesting term to use. But the stigma around that, I was very fearful of the stigma. I knew that I'd been through an episode, I knew I'd recovered, and I think it took me about 10 years to really open up and say in my employment, I had this experience. And I'm not sure whether stigma's changed today, I don't know. I think there's more information out there about it. I think it's more acceptable in some ways to have had mental health difficulties. I think people are a bit more open But saying that, I think there's still a long way to go. I think psychosis can happen to anybody at any time. I've met people in my working profession as a mental health nurse. I've met people in their 80s who have had a first episode of psychosis. I met a woman who her husband had died, and when she was out, she would see him by her side. It was quite distressing, and that distress caused a discomfort and affected her quality of life. So we're more likely to say that's a psychosis, because it's affecting her quality of life in a negative way. So she was in her 80s, and she had her first episode. And I do know that the early intervention teams usually work with people from age of 14, and I think that's more to do with the biology of the brain and how it's developing. And as my understanding is that they don't tend to diagnose people with psychosis unless they're over 14, because the brain's underdeveloped. So they need to know it's not a developmental process that's taking place. They need to know the brain's developed before they can say, well, it's probably psychosis. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but that's just how the system tends to work with people from 14 to 35, and that's the prime time for a first episode. Or not just the first episode, but the chances of recovering from that first episode in that age group. Around about a third of people will get psychosis and fully recover, even though it might be a prolonged recovery, and never have the symptoms again. And about a third of people will have symptoms that come throughout their lives, usually at stressful times. And the other third of people will have something that stays with them forever. So yes, you can fully recover, and I think it's having the right support and a belief that maybe this is not real. It's really important. But that's hard to do when it feels so real. And I think one of the things that I've used in my life since with other people is that if something seems that real, that's probably when we should question it and think maybe it's not. Because if we look back on our lives, we look back on yesterday and we say, what did we do yesterday? Most of us can pick out bits, but we can't remember the whole thing. But people who tend to have psychosis have so much detail about every part of it that it can't be real. Something seems too real, then it's probably worth looking at it as it probably isn't, because everyday life isn't that real. Anybody who's got symptoms of psychosis, the earlier that it's caught, the better chance they've got of recovery, and I think that happens for lots of reasons. One is they get treatment early, so they don't have to suffer the symptoms as much, so it's less stressful on them, their body and their mind. I think the other reason I come across in my work with young people in psychosis is that understanding it from a psychological point of view, that this might not be real, and then having a belief that it's most likely not real, is far better to have that at the beginning of the belief, because the more time it's taken to find that out, the belief in their head becomes stronger, and they believe it more and more and more, because they're looking for the signs to prove them right. They're looking for whatever it is that they believe is happening to them, that people are following, so their story becomes bigger, becomes more entrenched, and that's harder to move. So the earlier the better, and that's why I think it's important to get there early and to talk about it. Though it's difficult, and I think it's difficult especially for men to talk about themselves and their health. Women I found, and young women in my work I found, tend to be a bit more open about it. People don't believe them, but they tend to be a bit more open about it, and they start to close down when they think nobody believes them. But men just tend not to talk about it anyway, which makes it difficult. Well, I think the difficulty of my episode was that I was okay and looked okay until the point where I wasn't. So because mine was drug related, it happened quite instantly. But for lots of people, I think some of the signs that people might want to look out for is overstress and starting to believe odd things that they might not used to believe, especially conspiracy type theories or starting to see things that other people can't see, hear things that other people can't hear. The mind is quite, like I say, it's a very delicate organ, and under so much stress, who knows what it does, but we do know that most people who get psychosis, it's because of increased stress. It's not because they're taking drugs. It's not because they've got a family history. It's because they're overstressed and the mind can't cope. Although I have fully recovered, after the 2 years, I felt that I needed to give back to society in some way. So it changed my outlook on life, in that I was more willing to help people. Not that I didn't help people before, but I felt that my career was going in a different way. And if I'd not had the psychosis, maybe I would have continued with my drug journey, and who knows where I would have been now. So for me, it certainly changed my life for the more positive. And things that I thought were important at the time are less important now. You know, family, friends, life is more important, and doing what we want in life is far more important than trying to please everybody else. So I think I became more who I am now through my psychosis. It showed me that actually there is another way to live.